Okay, I'll take that as a yes. If there are any issues, just put your questions or comments on chat. So first of all, thank you to Malhar and everyone else at Khaki for giving me an opportunity to speak today. What I'll be talking about today is the lives of three individuals who are no doubt quite familiar with you: Rammohan Roy, Dwarkanath Tagore, and Jamshedji Jijibai. But hopefully I'll talk about a little bit different aspects of their lives than what is commonly discussed. Because my interest in looking at these three people is thinking about early Indian liberal thought, which of course was kind of a precursor to Indian nationalism. These three figures we associate as being a particular type of leader. So Rammohan is regarded as being kind of a political or a social figure. Dwarkanath and Jamshedji are considered more of a business or economic figure. And I want to kind of mix and change that up. And so I'll be talking a little bit today about Rammohan's economic views and the political activities of Dwarkanath and Jamshedji. And my purpose in doing so is to show how deeply interconnected the political and economic lives and business lives of these people were. It's impossible really to separate out these different facets of their lives because they're so deeply entwined with one another. All three of these individuals thought very globally. And this is something that I'm trying to bring out in the next book that I'm writing, where I'm looking at global connections in the 19th century and how that shaped Indian nationalist thought, or before that, Indian liberal political thought. There were particular media by which individuals like, the three people you see on the screen today thought about the world and learned about the world. One was the spread of global news, global intellectual currents that came via books, printing press being, brought across India and books being published or republished. And lastly, and most importantly, probably travel. All three of these individuals traveled quite a bit. And that travel, as we see, shaped their political views and shaped their political views in ways that had a resonance, over a long stretch of time. So without further ado, we can begin with the first individual that I want to talk about, which is Rammohan Roy. Rammohan is oftentimes thought of as being the first Indian liberal, the father of modern India. Many of these, sobriquets are perhaps a little bit exaggerated. I mean, certainly he was someone who was instrumental at the very beginning of liberal thought in India. But it is perhaps more productive to see him, as I've described on the screen over here, the first global citizen of India. He is someone who saw interconnections between social, political, and economic affairs in India and tied that with his thoughts on religion. But he was someone who thought about all of these things in a very global way. So with regard to religion, for example, I mean, he was not just a student of and a critic of religions like Hinduism and Buddhism or Islam, but also a prominent thinker and critic also of Christianity. He developed eventually an affinity for Christian Unitarianism, which was something that was quite popular 2 centuries ago. And he, of course, ultimately established his own religious movement, the Brahmo Samaj, which is still around. He was a champion of liberal thought, and liberal thought, so defined, is a brand of thought which put a great emphasis on the liberty of the individual, the rights of the individual, ideas like constitutions. Around the time that Rammohan was active, so in the 1810s, 1820s, early 1830s, ideas like democracy are kind of in their embryo. So you have the emergence of reformed parliaments in places like Great Britain, of course, the heritage of the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And Rammohan is someone who's looking at all of these developments and thinking about this. And in particular, when he hears news from the rest of the world about liberal political revolutions in places like Spain or Portugal, he's very excited by these. I mean, when he's living in Calcutta in the 1820s, he actually hosts dinners and celebrations when a particular moment happens in a part of the world very separate from where he's living. He follows what's happening in South America with the Bolivarian revolutions, where various countries throw off the yoke of Spanish imperialism. And as a result of this global mindedness, he also caught the attention of many people around the world who are thinking about similar things. So Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher living in London, wrote to him. JCL Sismondi, the Swiss-French political economist, was someone who wrote about him and tried to put some of his works into the French public sphere as well. Even as far away as Guatemala, people knew about him. In the case of Guatemala, it was through the intervention of people like Jeremy Bentham. So as Ramahan was thinking about the world was also getting to know Ramahan as well. But the interesting thing about Ramahan is that at least when he's living in Calcutta, up until the year 1830, he had a very curious blind spot, and that was economics. So he talked a lot about freedom of speech. He talked about individual liberty. He talked about religious, pluralism, as well as debated endlessly with various religious figures about the nature of God and the nature of religion. But the one thing that he did not really talk about that much is economics. And I find that particularly curious because in the 1810s and 1820s, this is when ideas of Indian poverty and India's relative laggardness in comparison with the West really come to the fore. And you have a lot of people around India and also in places in Europe talking about these problems of India's relative economic backwardness, things like the drain of wealth. And Ramahan, by and large, is not really talking about it. If he talks about economics at all, he largely parrots the views of colonial officials who say that things are getting better, who say that things like the permanent settlement in Bengal, which was, marketed at least as kind of like a policy to kind of cultivate landed elites that would take interest in their estates. He claimed that things like that were working quite well. Other people in India were talking quite vehemently about economic issues, but he was not. Now, this changes, and it changes through the medium of travel. Ramahan, in the year 1830, leaves Calcutta, and he arrives in Liverpool in early 1831, and he spends his last 3 years of his life in Great Britain. And in comparison with the rest of his life, this is not really much written about. I mean, there is one very good book by a scholar called Lynn Zastopil in the United States, which does an exceptionally good job of detailing his life. But in relation to the other aspects of Ramahan's life, it's less known. It's less discussed. But I think in many ways it is somewhere the most significant aspect of his life. Ramahan was someone who took a great interest in the pedagogical or educational value of travel. So he thought travel that would be, quote, a tool which would promote the reciprocal advantage and enjoyment of the whole human race, end quote. So he was not someone who was held back by caste prejudice against crossing the Kalapani. He had long wanted to travel to Great Britain for a few reasons. He wanted to see, the country that, of course, had, created such an impression in India. But he also wanted to travel there to witness, important pieces of legislation that were about to be discussed. And so, I'll talk about it in a bit. And he was one of many people in India at the time who were thinking of traveling to Great Britain. So another important reformer, a man by the name of Ramraj, who was based in Mysore and in Madras, also wanted to visit Great Britain. He never made it there, but there was general, even though there was caste prejudice amongst Hindus about traveling towards Great Britain, outside of India anywhere, a lot of people were interested in doing so. And so he arrived in Liverpool in April 1831, and he was immediately plunged into various activities in Great Britain. And the one thing that struck him more than anything else, I think, was the industrial and technological advancement of the country. Because, Great Britain in the year 1831 was the world's most technologically advanced country. It was, the first country to experience the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was just starting off in other countries in the rest of the world, like France and Germany and the United States. And other than, these countries and maybe Belgium, that was it, right? I mean, industrialization was really non-existent. And so when Ramahan travels to places like Liverpool, or even more important than that, Manchester, he's absolutely blown away by what he sees. He traveled the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the world's first interurban railway line, which you see on the screen, in 1831, a year after it was inaugurated. And this travel was so fantastical to him that it actually left him speechless. Now, Ramahan was someone who always liked to talk and express his opinions. So when his friends realize that he's not saying anything while on this train ride, they know that this is significant, right? That this is something that's really struck him. And once he arrives in Manchester, he tours cotton mills and industrial sites and factories that make machines. And similarly, his breath is kind of taken away by all of this activity. I mean, here's a man who's grown up in India, and he lived in the most wealthy and advanced city, Calcutta. But even though Calcutta was the most wealthy and advanced city in India, it was not anything in comparison to what was going on in a place like Manchester in terms of the sophistication of the economy, the technological achievements, the amount of new activity going on. So this leaves an impression on Ramahan, and we'll see in a little bit how it shapes eventually things like his economic views. Now, as I mentioned, one thing Ramahan was interested in traveling to Great Britain for was to take part in important legislative reform movements that were going on in the early 1830s. And one of that was the Reform Act of 1832, which was the first step towards making Britain somewhat democratic. I mean, Britain really is not fully democratic, one could argue, until, say, 1928, when all women are given the right to vote. But this is the first step to kind of try to widen the franchise and make parliamentary constituencies a little bit more representative. This was an extremely controversial act, but something that Ramahan thought was extremely necessary. And Ramahan saw the Reform Act as not only having implications for Great Britain, but implications for India and the wider world. He said, quote, "The welfare of England, nay, the entire world depended on it," end quote. And he also argued that the Reform Act would have a significant impact for India, because if India were to actually benefit somehow politically, it could only do so by reform happening in Great Britain, and that reform directing kind of a way for certain liberal principles to be inculcated in the administration. The Abolition Act of 1833 was, another important legislation that was put on the anvil, and this was a piece of legislation to get rid of slavery, and this particular bill was put forth by the Whig administration, and it had excited a lot of interest actually in India as well. If you read newspapers from Bombay or Calcutta, from around the 1830s, you see a lot of discussion going on about the Abolition Act and the idea that black people could have political rights, and many people were equating the rights of blacks with the rights of Indians. And while in Great Britain, Ramahan reaches out to key reformists who are involved in the Abolition Act. So he meets people like William Wilberforce, William Roscoe, Lord Brougham. These are all people who are instrumental in getting the act passed. And the last act that really takes his a good chunk of his interest is, of course, something that is focused directly on India, and that's the Charter Act of 1833, where the Charter of the East India Company was put up for revision and renewal, and Ramahan decides to actually take part in debate over this legislation by submitting written testimony. And the testimony is the image that you see on the slide. He publishes a pamphlet that's distributed widely in Great Britain and across India as well, and he gives his opinions on what reform should looks like. And importantly, it's here that he finally talks about something like economic affairs in India. So in this particular document that he puts forth, he talks about the poverty of riots, the fact that things like the permanent settlement was not actually working to the benefit of all Indians. The opening up of trade under the previous Charter Act had actually done some damage to the relative prosperity of Indians. And perhaps most importantly, he makes one of the earliest quantifications of a drain of wealth from the country. He takes statistics that were published by the British Indian government and calculates that anywhere from 2 to 3 million pounds annually were being drained away from India. And this is significant because it continues a tradition that's taken all throughout the 19th century from people like, Naoroji, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, Ranade, and on to the earlier 20th century, indeed our century today, right? I mean, people are still trying to calculate, if the drain of wealth existed, how much was that amount, right? And you have economists still doing that. And he's doing this in 1832, 1833. Now, the last interesting part of this moment of his life is that he actually contemplates standing for election to the British Parliament. When the Reform Act is put forth, people like Jeremy Bentham argue that the empire should have some representation in the British Parliament as well. So Bentham actually approaches Rammohun and asks, would you be interested in standing for Parliament? And Bentham hoped to get someone from the Caribbean and someone from another part of the empire along with India to stand for election. And Rammohun actually declares that he has interest. He says that he's willing to be in Parliament for a few months in order to pave the way for the other countrymen who are willing to spend a longer time in the British Parliament. So you nearly had an Indian MP as early as 1833. It doesn't come into play for reasons I'll discuss right now. The other important aspect of Rammohun's time in Great Britain is that he's looking beyond Britain itself to see what things are like in other countries. So he takes a great interest in France. When the July Revolution of 1830 takes place, which deposes the Bourbon monarchy, which had been in place since Napoleon had been removed from power, and installs Louis Philippe, the so-called citizen king, in power, he's overjoyed. When he sees French ships on the way to travel to Great Britain, he tries to reach out to them and express his gratefulness to the French for having overthrown a autocratic monarchy. When he was based in London, he actually traveled to Paris. We know very, very little about what happens when he went to Paris. But what we do know is that when he came back, he definitely was much more radicalized. And so some individuals speculated that the people that he met in Paris, including the king and others like Guizot, who was an important minister at the time, actually radicalized his political thought. And he looked at the Post-Reform Act Parliament with a bit more of a jaundiced perspective as a result. The other country he was interested in exploring was the United States. Now, Rammohun, since the 1820s, had been in touch with many people in the US, people in Boston, Baltimore, other parts of the country, and primarily people in the US were interested in Rammohun's views on religion. Many people in the US, like the UK, thought that Rammohun was on the verge of converting to Christianity, which was not the case. But Rammohun, in addition to having interest in Christianity and how Christianity was practiced in the United States, was also interested in the politics of the country. So he asked his American correspondents about key legislation. He was interested in debates going on between slaveholding states and free states. And when he's in London, he lays the foundations for a possible trip to the United States. No less than a former president of Harvard University announced to a group of people in London that Rammohun was soon to be expected in the United States, and people were preparing for his arrival there. That unfortunately never happens, because in late 1833 he dies, very suddenly of something that was called brain inflammation. We don't know exactly what that was, but he passed away in Bristol. And if you travel to Bristol today, you can still see his tomb. I visited about maybe 10, 12 years ago or so, and if you're in a nondescript part of Bristol, you'll see this Indian-style chhatri peeking out on top of a fence, and that's the resting place of Rammohun Roy. So that's Roy's story. The other individual, the second of the individuals I'll talk about is Dwarkanath Tagore, and Tagore had a lot in common with Rammohun. I mean, obviously they lived in the same city. Rammohun, in many ways, had acted as a co-worker in political activities with Dwarkanath. In some cases, you could regard Dwarkanath as being kind of a protege of Rammohun, in the sense that he eventually took over things like the Brahmo Samaj. But most importantly, for our purposes, Dwarkanath was an extremely wealthy individual. He was an individual who became an important commercial magnate, the head of the Tagore family, someone who was called the Bengali Medici, right, in a reference to the political economic family in medieval Italy. And one of Tagore's goals was to import the Industrial Revolution to Bengal. So he did things like he set up a steamship company, a coal mining company, and eventually he wanted to do much more and establish some sort of industrial base in the country. He, in addition to doing these activities for industrial promotion, was also very keenly interested in political and religious reform. So he joined Rammohun in his campaigns for things like freedom of the press, abolition of sati. He was a key advocate for a proposal called colonization in India, whereby British individuals would be allowed to settle in India without any limitations, which does not make too much sense to us today in terms of having perhaps reformist implications. But the idea essentially was that if you attracted wealthy Britons to India to settle permanently, they could invest in the country, they could bring capital, and they could help economically develop the country. And equally importantly, since they were in the country, they could also fight for certain political rights, the same rights and responsibilities that they would be expected to have in Great Britain, and hopefully would be extended to Indians as well. So in many ways, Dwarkanath was Rammohun's successor. And when news of Rammohun's passing reaches Calcutta in 1833, the mantle of responsibility falls on Dwarkanath's shoulders. Now, like Rammohun, Dwarkanath is keenly interested in traveling to Europe. And he does this on two occasions. He makes his first travel in 1842, and a few years later he's back. The first trip that he makes in 1842 is as a representative of something called the Landholders Association, which is probably the first modern political association in India. It was a group of wealthy zamindars and Bengali Badrulok who get together, and they form an association that tries to campaign for political issues, and this group sends Rammohun as their official delegate in that year. On the second trip that he makes in 1845-46, he's accompanied by his son and nephew, and both his son and nephew take part in a whole gamut of activities in Great Britain. They attend Royal Institution lectures that are given by Michael Faraday, for example, on electromagnetism. And there were a few medical students that accompanied Tagore and his son and nephew as well, who were there to study medicine. So it's not just Tagore that's traveling. He's part of a movement of people who are increasingly gravitating to London and other parts of Great Britain for education or for political ties. The one thing that Dwarkanath does is he combines this trip to Great Britain for political purposes with a larger tour around Europe and the Mediterranean. So he visits countries including Egypt, Italy, and France. He has an audience with the Pope in Rome. When he's in Great Britain, he dines with Queen Victoria. He plays cards with Prince Albert in Buckingham Palace. He visits Florence, where he tours sites associated with the Medicis. And in Paris, he meets with people like Louis Philippe, Francois Guizot, the French minister and historian. And he also forges ties with scholars. So one of the scholars he meets in Paris was Max Muller. And Max Muller at the time was a very young student of a man called Eugene Bernouf. And for all apparent purposes, Max Muller and Tagore hit it off. And they hit it off so well that they actually hold sessions where they sing and kind of play the pianoforte together. So Tagore would sing songs in French or Italian or in Bengali, and Muller would accompany him on the pianoforte. So a pretty unique moment in terms of cross-racial friendship. The travel that Dwarkanath embarked upon in Europe was also littered with some scandal. So Tagore's parties were famous for being over the top. So on one occasion, he threw a party in Paris on a street called Avenue de Marigny, which is close to the Champs-Élysées, and it was so spectacularly decorated with lights and banners and such that apparently it spooked horses. Horses were afraid to trot by that particular street. On another moment, he caused scandal because at a party he courted the wife of important Frenchman and actually asked for her hand in marriage, and that apparently led to a near duel between Dwarkanath and the husband. So Dwarkanath became somewhat of a celebrity when he was in France, so much so that when he visits Versailles, he's greeted as the king of the Celestial Empire. That's how he's announce to people who are there in Versailles, and it kind of it's a testament to kind of the hyperbole and ruse that was associated with Dwarkanath, his the kind of personality that he embodied. Now, this was only one particular aspect of Dwarkanath's travel. So yes, there was kind of the bombast, the pomp, the scandal. But if you dig a bit deeper, it's important to recognize that in all of this, there was a search for influence that had political implications. Dwarkanath tried to wield his fortune and his ability to kind of grab attention to influence the cause and promote the cause of Indian reform. So when he traveled, he surrounded himself with reformist figures. When he went to Italy, he met Muhammad Ali, who was the reforming Pasha, and he tried to convince Muhammad Ali to build a railway line between the Red Sea and the Nile to promote travel between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, with an eye to how this would influence trade for a country like India. When he went to Ireland, he stayed with the great reformist leader Daniel O'Connell at his house in County Kerry. In Great Britain, he befriended people like Lord Brougham or Charles Babbage, the mechanical genius. And all of these attempts were meant to kind of inculcate Dwarkanath within a reformist elite that was talking about technology, economic reform, all of these types of things. He discusses with these people ideas like the need for Indian parliamentary representation. So in his first trip, he meets with a very young William Gladstone, who at the time was the colonial secretary, and he talks about the need to get rid of religious qualifications to serve in the House of Commons, because that would prejudice the ability of someone like a Hindu to be allowed in the House of Commons, because at the time you could only really be a Christian, a Catholic or a Protestant. Even Jews had trouble getting in Parliament at the time. Another figure he befriends is this man on the screen, a man called George Thompson, who probably most of you have never heard of, but who was a very influential man in his own way. Thompson was one of the leading reformist figures in Britain at the time. He took up various types of reform. So he took up causes like free trade, parliamentary reform, the abolition of slavery, and also Indian political reform. And he kind of put this under one giant umbrella. And in Britain, he was associated with something called the British Indian Society, which was established in 1839 and fought for some measure of reform of the British Indian government that would ameliorate poverty and despotism as was practiced by the East India Company at the time. Dwarkanath evidently does a lot to kind of cultivate ties with Thompson, and he actually invites Thompson back to Calcutta when he returns, and Thompson agrees. And so Thompson travels with Dwarkanath back and stays in Calcutta for a few months. And while Thompson is in Calcutta, he sets up a branch of the British Indian Association in Calcutta called the Bengal British India Association. He lectures non-stop in Calcutta. He speaks to mechanical associations, political associations. In one speech, he urged Indians to emulate Benjamin Franklin, the American patriot, because he thought of Franklin as being the ideal combination of a statesman and a scientist. Someone who was thinking about science and technology as well as political rights and responsibilities, and he urged Indians to take up industrialization. And in all these aspects, we can see how Thompson's views were actually shaped by Dwarkanath. Because before he met Dwarkanath, all that Thompson really talked about when he talked about the Indian economy was agriculture. And it was probably through Tagore's influence that Thompson started to think of the industrial possibilities for India and started to talk about how, if Great Britain can build a city like Manchester, then Indians can do the same as well. Now, like Dwarkanath's mentor, Ramohan, Dwarkanath passes away abroad. He passes away in London, and he passes away in 1846, which perhaps fortuitously for him takes place because in 1847 a financial crisis hits Calcutta, and much of his family fortune is blown away. There's a big financial crisis that hits Bengal in 47-48, and a lot of the work that Tagore had done to kind of build up this industrial base and commercial base and a complementary political base as well takes a huge setback as well. So that is the story of the two Bengalis that take part in this talk. For the remainder, I'm going to shift my focus to familiar venues here in Bombay and talk about Jamshedji Jijibai. And one reason why I think it's important to talk about Jamshedji is, in this period, in the early 19th century, we tend to focus far too much on Bengal and Calcutta and the Bengali elite that's emerging. And it's important to remember that places like Bombay, as well as places like Madras, were important centers for liberal political reform as well. And all you have to do is look at early newspapers from this era, some of which survive, most of which are gone, but some which survive at places like the Maharashtra State Archives. And a few months ago, I was looking at some of these. They're in terrible, awful condition and falling apart. But if you're able to read them and put up with conditions there, you really are able to find some really interesting stuff. And Bombay newspapers were as actively following things like the Reform Act, the abolition of slavery, the Charter Act, as papers and individuals in Bengal. And Jamshedji was an important part of this liberal elite. He was, of course, an opium baron. Quite literally, as I've said, since he eventually gets a baronetcy. He had made fantastic amounts of money through, essentially the illegal smuggling of opium into China. It was illegal, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, of course, under company rule, in the sense that the company and its Indian interlocutors take part and make, lots and lots of money on opium smuggling, smuggling of a drug that was illegal in China. But Jamshedji, from an early point, funnels a lot of his wealth into political activities as well. So, just at the same time that the Bengal British India Association was being set up, or the British Indian Association in London was being set up, he joins a few individuals in Bombay to set up a Bombay branch of that association. We don't know what happens to it, but it at least was established and probably was around for a little bit of time. He was someone who enjoyed very, very strong global connections around the world. So if you look at figures like William Jardine or James Matheson, the two big opium merchants based out of Hong Kong, he was corresponding with them regularly. I mean, with people like Jardine, literally every week. And if you go into the Mumbai University Library, you can see many of these letters. His offices in Fort, his house was around until the 1980s, and then it burned down. But you can still see it today. If the site of it, if you go to Fort today, from that house in Fort, he was communicating with people in the United States, in China, the Philippines, Singapore, what is today places like Indonesia and Malaysia. He was entertaining people who came to Bombay from around the world. So, as early as 1851, Jamshedji is covered in an American journal. A journal called the North American Review, which is actually still around, and an American who had visited Bombay actually writes a very laudatory piece about Jamshedji and the particular charity that he's doing in Bombay. For all intents and purposes, Jamshedji seemed on the surface to be a very loyal subject of the British Empire, in the sense that he was eventually knighted and made and given a baronetcy. He was someone who wore a gold medal of Queen Victoria on his chest, and yet under the surface there were some real grievances that someone like Jamshedji had about colonial rule and about the lack of rights that Indians had, and I'm going to detail that a little bit more. And a lot of the grievances that Jamshedji had about colonial rule came to the surface through war. And this is an important theme of early Indian liberalism. If you look at the work of historians like Linda Colley, who's a historian in Princeton University in the United States, she's talked about how war was a very important factor in liberal political thought. The two might not seem to really go together with one another, but she's written a really fantastic book about how modern constitutions are in many ways the product of warfare during the 18th and 19th century. And here in India, I think you can detect a similar dynamic taking place, where the experience of colonial warfare convinces many Indian elites that they do not have proper rights, that their fiscal and political autonomy is being violated on multiple levels by British colonial rule. So the 1830s and 1840s were a particularly bloody moment in the Indian Empire. There was the first Opium War that took place in China. There was the first Afghan war that took place in Afghanistan, terribly bloody incident, and eventually there were wars in other parts of the empire, in Persia, etc., etc. Places like Sindh, the expansion of the empire into Punjab. And because of all of this warfare going around the Indian Empire, the Indian exchequer was drained to a very high degree. I mean, the amount of money that's flowing out of the exchequer is quite phenomenal. And so Jamshedji starts criticizing the amount of money that the government is paying on warfare, particularly in regard to the Opium War. Because the Opium War on the surface might seem to serve the interests of someone in the the opium trade, but actually it didn't. Because when the Opium War takes place, the Chinese government seizes cartons of massive shipments of opium from Bombay merchants, and this is all written off as losses. And so Jamshedji actually tries to leverage his influence to get some sort of compensation from the British Parliament for all this money that he and his friends in Bombay had lost. So he writes these very stinging letters to friends in Great Britain, many of whom were MPs or very influential people in their own way. And he talks about how, in order to get compensation, that was the only thing, that was required really to, satisfy their fundamental rights. He talked about how the honor of the country, India, had been violated. And as the British Parliament puts off any debate about compensation and kind of ignores people like Jamshedji, he gets more and more furious. And he eventually tries to contact people as high up as the Prime Minister, people like Robert Peel or the Duke of Wellington, the hero of the Napoleonic Wars, in order to try to get them to listen to Indian demands for some sort of compensation. And at the end, nothing really happens. And this is a moment of great bitterness for Jamshedji. And if you see his letter writing as he realizes that no one is listening to him, you see how bitter he's become. He talks about how Indians, after all, were, quote unquote, distant subjects of the crown who, quote, have no parliamentary influence. All faith and dependence upon British honor are gone right now. We, the people of India, are made sufferers because we are helpless and our voices are too feeble to be heard, end quote. So this is a man who has, on the surface, lost his faith in British rule and seems to be quite critical of the British Empire. This eventually changes. He moderates his criticism, and if you read the work of people like Murli Ranganathan, he speculates that one reason he kind of gets back in favor is because he's offered knighthood by the British, and then you see a kind of moderating of criticism that Jamshedji is willing to offer the British. But importantly, and this is also something that Murli points out, the people in his circle make even more full-throated condemnation of British rule. So some of you are familiar with an individual called Bhaskar Panduram, who was a clerk of Jamshedji, and he wrote these 8 letters to a Bombay newspaper, the Bombay Gazette, in 1841, called the Letters of a Hindu. And in these letters, the type of criticism he offers of British rule is absolutely excoriating. I mean, this is a precursor to the type of revolutionary nationalism you see much later, the type of language that he's using. He says, quote, India has been got hold of by a race of demons whose government was the most bitter curse India has ever been visited with, end quote. This is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the type of language that he uses, and he blames the British for spending so much money on warfare in places like Afghanistan or China, and consequently neglecting issues happening at home. Now, Jamshedji, as I said, eventually drifts into a more of a loyalist frame of mind. This certainly comes to the fore by the time of the Crimean War in the early 1850s and the uprising in 1857. But he does participate in political activity that launches Indian nationalism. So things like the Bombay Association, which are founded in 1852, 1853, which sent a petition to Parliament around the time that the Charter Act of 1853 is being debated. And the people involved in that association are people who eventually go on to do stuff like found the Indian National Congress, people like Dadabhai Naoroji, others who are kind of in that milieu like Naoroji Fardunji, Jagannath Shankar Sheth, etc., etc. So let me just conclude on this particular point. If you look at this era, you see many people who are considered as loyalists, or a handful of people who might be thought of as very strongly anti-colonial, and it's very hard to kind of make a black and white distinction between people in this era. Because on one surface, all 3 of the people I've talked about were loyal subjects of the empire, and they talked about the benefits that India supposedly got from British rule. But on the other hand, they were also deeply critical. And it's important to keep that complex perspective in mind. and know that it's not just this kind of distinction between loyalists and anti-loyalists. And even people who are involved in something like the opium trade, which was one of the ultimate venues for colonial commerce, could be quite critical of colonial rule as well. These people who the three people I talk about over here put a great importance on the role of travel for learning. So I mean, both Dwarkanath and Ramohan traveled towards the end of the life. Jamshedji did not, but he had traveled early in his life. He had traveled to China about 4 or 5 times as a youth, and on one time he was actually commandeered by French ships and taken off to South Africa. So these people were internationally minded, and they wanted to encourage other people to travel as well. Jamshedji himself later on in life says, he's not in a physical state to travel, but if he were, he would like to travel to Great Britain. And the last thing I just want to say is that all three of these people, thought a little bit about ideas of representation. And the ideas of representation that they came up with would be taken on by a later generation. People like Bhaudaji Lad, for example, right? Bhaudaji Lad is sitting in the same association with Jamshedji Jijibai, the Bombay Association in the early 1850s. And people like Bhaudaji Lad take on this tradition of thinking of imperial warfare and connecting it with the idea of political rights. So after the uprising of 1857 was over, a lot of historians have said this was a moment that kind of set back the cause of Indian political reform and the idea of Indian representation. And actually, if you dig a bit deeper, you notice that story is a bit complex. Because people like Bhaudaji Lad, actually, right after the mutiny took place, were saying that now is the time that Indians need to get some sort of representation. He gave a speech in, I think, 1859, where he talked about the inevitability of constitutional government in India and the need for India to evolve into, quote, a nation of free men, end quote. And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much for listening today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Dinyar. Before I move on to the questions and points, just wanted to mention the beautiful narrative right from 1772 to 1859 covered, across the three personalities and figures. So I definitely would come back on this question that I have, but before that, we'll address few questions that have come in.
Yeah.
So one of the first question that has come in from Arun, and this was when you had spoken about Raja Ram Mohan Roy. How was it that Indian citizens could contest in British elections and become MPs?
Yeah.
Seems incredible that the British people would vote for an Indian to become an MP in their own country in 1800s when apartheid and skin color discrimination was the norm.
Yeah, there are two explanations for that. One is the British Parliament was not democratic, so the means for getting into Parliament were very limited, and it was confined to a group of landed elites, some industrialists, and a few other rich people. And these few other rich people could actually be pretty okay with the idea of another fellow elite from another country, perhaps communicating with them, socializing with them, and therefore the idea of a person like that actually sitting in Parliament was not so far-fetched. Actually, there were ideas for what were called half castes, and those were not necessarily people from India, but people who might be mulatto or half African, etc., contesting Parliament. And that whole discussion was caught up in debate around the Reform Act of 1832. You have to remember also that a lot of the elite Britons who were in Parliament at that time had ties with India, and some of them had Indian blood. They had mothers or grandmothers who were Indian. So it's not as outlandish as one would think at this moment. The other reason is that the individuals who were thought of for contesting Parliament were technically British subjects, and the idea of British subjecthood was so loose at this moment that even if you lived in, say, a place like Canada or Bermuda or India or Malaya, you could stand for Parliament, right? Again, a lot of people who stood for Parliament in Great Britain, even though they were British, they had spent most of their lives in some part of the empire, right? They had been born in places like Madras or Calcutta or Toronto or other places. So it's a moment where the empire and Britain itself there's not as much of a distinction as we might see later on.
Great. I hope, Arun, that does answer your question. There was also one question. I think this was in context to when you were speaking about uh, Dwarkanath Tagore. And it was in context. It's a question from Yashpal where he says, were these perks and fringes thrown at English speaking intellectuals to side with them to carry on their agenda of colonialism?
So I mean, perks and fringes. I'm not exactly sure. It's thrown at the English-speaking intellectuals. So I'm not exactly sure what the perks mean over here. The perks or fringes. I mean, if you're talking about the parties and the the favors that were done, yes. I mean Dwarkanath was well known in Calcutta also for being a very amiable host and inviting the British elite to kind of party or eat with him. So yeah, I mean you throw a big party, you invite a lot of people, and then maybe you strike up conversation with them or you follow up with them later on, and that's how you kind of go about with your work. I mean, you see the same thing happening today, right? Whether you're in Mumbai or London or New York. So yeah, socialization was one way to kind of build up political capital as well.
Okay, I think there's a related question. So in reply to your first answer, Gurpreet says, what makes that distinction then? When does the diversity get to the levels that we are used to seeing?
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, in the 1880s, a number of Indians stand for election to parliament. They all lose, right? But as late as the early 1880s, when so I mean, the British Parliament goes through another round of reform around 1865 and another round of reform in 1885. And by 1885, maybe 25% of men are allowed to vote. Women, of course, are not allowed to vote. So it's more popular. More working people are allowed to vote, but that's still a relatively small number. And still, a number of those people are willing to vote for an Indian. I mean, so if you think of someone like Lal Mohan Ghosh, who actually stands for election in 1885 from Deptford, and which is an area by Greenwich in London, he comes very close to winning in 1885. And one of the groups that really supports him are the Irish. So even as late as 1885, those racial distinctions are not as hardwired as we'd imagine them to be. And you remember, I mean, Naoroji, of course, wins election in 1892, but after Naoroji, two other people win, right? I mean, you have, more than two people win. You have Manshuji Bhavanagri, you have a man called Edward Suarez, who is half Goan, who's elected in the 1890s, and then, of course, you have Shapoorji Saklatwala later on in the early 20th century. So it's hard to answer those questions. I mean, yes, there was a very strong racial undercurrent in Britain, especially after the Mutiny Uprising. But there are ways that British culture could surprise you, or not just British culture, any other culture. I mean, if you look at France, France was electing black people to the French Assembly throughout this entire period, right? I mean, a black individual from Senegal sits in the National Assembly in the early 20th century and rises to a very high position. So history is stranger than we imagine it to be. I mean, these racial divisions were not as strong as one could always imagine them to be. I mean, they were in one sense, but in another sense, they could be quite porous.
Yeah. And in this context, interesting point and a question by Shweta Gupta. Might be they were not just loyalists, but since they had created a lot of wealth, Britishers might also want to be partnering with them and be friendly with them. Is that possible?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think people like Dwarkanath and Jamshedji were international business people. And so Jamshedji is communicating with, Chinese individuals, British individuals, French, Spanish, Filipino, Americans, in addition to, his fellow Indians. So obviously there was a basis of international business there. But, it's important to complicate this idea of loyalism, right? It's not straightforward. They might have faith in the British Empire, but their idea of the British Empire was very different from the idea of most Britons, right? It's not one particular idea that's kind of a consensus at this moment.
One question from Arun. Would you know where exactly in Fort was the JJ residence?
I believe it was, so it's on DN Road. There is construction for an entrance to the metro station by something called Commissariat House. And if you look behind Commissariat House, there's a relatively new building done in an old style. I think it's been rented out to the Tatas right now. I can't remember what the name of the building is, but that was, I believe, where Jamshedji's house was around, and it was around until the 1980s. I mean, so Bombay, of course, has been quite callous with historical preservation. That burned down in the 1980s. If it had survived, it would have been an incredible building to preserve, right? I mean, one of the world's richest individuals would have lived there, and it was allowed to burn down not too long ago.
Okay, lot of appreciation points coming up. Misty mentions very educative and interesting talk. Deep thanks to you, Professor, and Khaki. Meher Mistry mentions thanks for the wonderful talk. Then we have Karen mentioning thank you, excellent talk and very informative. Millen mentions it was very nice information. All those people were visionary. And then I'm just going through it to make sure that if there were any questions that I might have missed. I can't see the name, but thank you, Professor and Khaki tools for excellent and informative talk. Shefali mentions it was the old handloom house, I believe, in with respect to the JJ residence that you'd spoken about.
Not sure about that. Yeah, I think that's different. That's across the street. Yeah.
Yeah. Yashpal has a question. I think it was with respect to the MP. Were certain parliamentary seats reserved for the countries ruled by the British? So I think that was something which had come up again. So, but I think most of the questions that were asked by the audience, I think I've addressed all of them. I have one question, and
So I'll just address Yashpal's question first very quickly.
Sure.
Yeah, for a long time it was debated whether colonies should get representation, and there was a whole movement for something called Greater Britain and imperial representation, but it never took off.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We have a point from Meher Mistry. JJ had an older house, which is today the Godavra Parsi Fire Temple. So that's what.
Meher, I'll talk to you offline, but be interested. The house was
Mr. Dinyar.
Yeah.
Mr. Dinyar, JJ bhai ever been to Karachi?
I have not been to Karachi. No.
Okay. No, JJ bhai ever been to Karachi?
Oh, I doubt it, quite frankly, because Karachi was just kind of up and coming at that point in time.
Yeah, because there are a lot of Parsis were here in Pakistan, particularly in Karachi, and I think maybe he has been ever to Karachi.
So he probably didn't make it there. So Karachi, as you'll know, Sindh was conquered by the British only in the 1840s, right? And Karachi really comes up after that. And Parsis only moved to Karachi in big numbers only after that. So it's a bit after Jamshedji's time. But yes, other important families definitely moved to Karachi and have operations from that point on. And you're probably familiar with the Dinshas, for example, or the Awaris and others.
Exactly, yeah. You are right.
Yeah, and so those families do eventually move out. Yeah, but for Jamshedji, it's still a bit early times. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so to my question, there's a little bit of prelude because in the initial part we missed your introduction as well. So I will, if you can give me a minute before I ask my question,
sure.
which is not necessarily related to only these three personalities and figures. So you are an associate professor at, of history at the SPJIMR Institute of Management and Research, and you've authored Naoroji, Pioneer of Indian Nationalism, and you've co-edited Dadabhai Naoroji, selected private papers with SR Mehrotra, and from Ghalib's Dilli to Lutyens New Delhi, a documentary record with Mushirul Hasan. You're recipient of the 2021 Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay New India Foundation Book Prize. which, the research for which has been supported by US Fulbright Commission, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Institute of Indian Studies. So my question is, you are at present working on a book on the global dimensions of liberal nationalism in India in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Can you just give us a glimpse of what this is about and what should we sort of looking forward to in this particular book?
Yeah, sure, sure. I put an emphasis on the word working because it's taken much longer than I anticipated. But I'm trying to look at the period between Rammohan Roy and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. So kind of before the Gandhian moment, and understand how particular Indian political ideas develop, and how those ideas are developed in relation with the circulation of global ideas about politics and economics and such. When we think about Indian nationalism, we tend to focus our perspective inwards and think about the development of Indian nationalism within the country itself and how certain ideas were generated within the country, like Swadeshi and such. But even if you take an idea like Swadeshi, it's remarkably global. Swadeshi was not developed in isolation. Swadeshi was an idea that was in communication with other forms of economic nationalism or economic revival around the world, and it took pages from economic experiments in Britain or the United States or eventually places like Japan, and we can see a similar dynamic taking place in the realm of political ideas. Indians thought about things like establishing a parliament, and so when as early as the 1840s, and when they thought about a parliament, they would make references not just to Great Britain, but also to, say, the United States. They'd look at the US Congress, they'd look at experiments in democratization in other countries, and some people were quite critical, others were not. So it's a very global conversation that's going on in India, and this, a lot of my story will take place in Bombay or Calcutta or Madras for that particular reason. These were the three major global entrepôts. But I'm trying to kind of put in communication Indian history with global history through this book.
Wonderful, wonderful. We'll look forward for and would love to hear when the book does get published, Dr. Dinyar. So definitely looking forward to it. I also can't help thinking about the fact that a lot of work that you mentioned about Raja Ram Mohan Roy came just before probably the year 32 and 33, when he passed away, and what would have been probably the scenario if he would have had a longer life, and we maybe would have seen more reforms coming in through. So I think it was a wonderful narrative. Thank you for giving your time on a Saturday evening, and thanks to the entire audience as well for tuning in and being attentive. It was wonderful audience as well. So thank you once again on behalf of Khaki, and looking forward to all the Saturday talks as well, Dr. Dinyar.
Thank you, Malhar, and thanks everyone in Khaki, and thanks for everyone for attending also. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Have a nice evening. Yep.
Okay,
Bye.
good. Thank you.